This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to CGTN, China Global Television Network. This is The World Today. I'm Hannah Viviers in Nairobi. Here are your top stories. At least 15 people dead in a fire at an explosive factory in Russia. U.S. House votes to refer former Trump advisor for criminal prosecution over the January 6th Capitol riot. And the WHO says more than 100,000 health workers have died of COVID-19. Let's begin in Russia, where AFP is reporting that at least 15 people have been killed following a factory fire. Authorities report an explosion took place at a gunpowder factory southeast of Moscow. The Ministry of Emergency Situations says 170 emergency workers and 50 vehicles were dealing with the fire. Officials are investigating the cause of the inferno. They say they'll be looking at safety procedure violations, among other possible causes. And to the European Union, leaders are blaming Warsaw for challenging the EU's legal basis. But Poland's prime minister says he will not bow to blackmail upon joining a summit of the bloc's 27 nations. Poland's constitutional tribunal ruled this month elements of EU law were incompatible with the country's charter. The decision challenges a central tenet of EU integration. French and Irish leaders have urged Warsaw to get back in line. Polish prime minister says he's ready to resolve disputes with Brussels. Well, Giles Gibson is following the developments from Brussels for us. Giles, thank you so much for joining us. Good to see you. Giles, what's the latest from the summit?
Well, heading into this two-day summit, Charles Michel, the president of the European Council, had said that this whole issue of Poland and the rule of law would be touched upon. But it appears that during that meeting that went late into the night on Thursday local time here in Brussels, that there was a much more substantive two-hour discussion about this standoff between Brussels and Poland. The European Council have said that this discussion was conducted with a serene mood, but it's also worth noting that there was not a press conference at the end of the first day of this two-day summit, which is certainly highly unusual. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor in particular, had been pushing for dialogue instead of confrontation with Warsaw, and that argument from one of the big power brokers of the European Council appears to have won the day. Those leaders also discussed over the course of the first day the rising energy prices that we have here in Europe as we head into the coldest winter months. There's been some decisions made in terms of the European Commission are going to go away and look at the electricity and the gas markets here in Europe. They've also said that they're going to take a look at the ETS scheme, which is Europe's carbon pricing scheme. There are some member states who are arguing that this scheme is pushing up prices for fossil fuels indirectly. The Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez had been calling for much more immediate action from Brussels about these rising energy prices in Europe. He talked about potentially the EU 27 actually buying natural gas collectively, the argument there being that they would just have much more bargaining power as a bloc rather than as individual countries. But at this stage that appears to have been kicked down the road, and so we are now waiting to see what comes out of the second day of the summit.
Giles, thank you so much on that agenda. Thank you so much for breaking it down for us. Giles Gibson speaking to us from Brussels. Well, the U.S. House has voted to refer Steve Bannon, the one-time advisor to former President Donald Trump, to the Justice Department for criminal prosecution. The resolution was adopted in a largely party line vote of 229 to 202. It accuses Bannon of contempt of Congress over his refusal to cooperate with the investigation into the January 6th Capitol riot. 9 Republicans sided with all Democrats. The matter next goes to the Justice Department. Attorney General Merrick Garland will make the final decision on whether to prosecute. Well, NATO officials have agreed on a new master plan to counter Russia. Strategy aims to prepare for any simultaneous attack in the Baltic and Black Sea regions. The military bloc reached the agreement as Russia develops weapon systems and deploys troops near its borders. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says relations with Russia are at a low point, but officials say they do not believe any Russia attack is imminent. Meanwhile, NATO has launched a $1 billion fund for cyberspace defense. Moscow denies any aggressive intent and says NATO's preparations will destabilize Europe. Meanwhile, Russia says the U.S. and its allies should unfreeze Kabul's assets so Afghanistan can start tackling urgent social and economic challenges. Russia's President Vladimir Putin says that countries that fought in Afghanistan for 20 years bear the primary responsibility for its humanitarian challenges. Putin also says Russia is considering delisting the Taliban as a terrorist organization. Talks are underway in Germany on the future of the new coalition government. The Social Democrats, which narrowly won last month's election, are negotiating with the Free Democrats and the Greens over a three-party deal. It's hoped the new administration will be in place by the time Germany takes over the leadership of the G7 group of leading industrial nations in January. But leaders are split on key issues like the economy and public spending. Ryan Thompson has more from Frankfurt.
Thursday marked the start of formal negotiations by Germany's so-called traffic light coalition after weeks of talks to take the temperature to see if this trio could work together in government. It's called the traffic light coalition because of the parties that will be a part of it. It's led by the red Social Democrats at the top, with the yellow Free Liberal Democrats and Green Party working just below them. The parties have set out an ambitious timeline to get ready to govern, and if all goes to plan, Olaf Scholz will take on Chancellor duties by early December. That'll be just in time for the European Council meeting, where all of the EU's 27 heads of state will gather. Germany has long held a lot of influence at this meeting, but with Angela Merkel currently sitting as a lame duck on her way out of office, that subsided a bit. But there's also a long way to go between now and then. Lots of agreements, lots of deals, and lots of concessions need to be made. The hardest part of the coalition negotiations is getting the Greens and the Liberal Democrats to see eye to eye. While both parties do sit to the left, it's the Social Democrats that unite them. Dozens of working groups will now focus on individual election issues, and anything that's not able to be agreed to will be passed on to party leaders when they reconvene in November. One of the biggest sticking points will likely be over who will take up Germany's second top job, the role of finance minister. Both the FDP and Greens are vying for the job, but the parties couldn't be farther apart over how they want to approach managing the country's finances. Ryan Thompson, CGTN, Frankfurt.
In Haiti, a man claiming to represent a notorious local gang has threatened to kill the missionaries they kidnapped if their demands are not met. The threat was made in a video posted on YouTube on Thursday. In it, the man, said to be Lamo Sanjo, an alias of the leader of the dreaded 400 Mawozo gang. Earlier, authorities say that the gang had demanded $1 million for each of the 17 hostages. On October the 16th, 16 Americans and 1 Canadian were abducted along with Haitian driver during their visits to an orphanage in western Haiti. The White House says the U.S. will do all it can to help resolve Haiti kidnappings. Hannah Viviers in Port-au-Prince has more.
People are afraid going out. Lamo Sanjo demanding $1 billion for each missionary that got kidnapped last, I think, 2 weeks ago. Today, the director of the police resigned because of the situation of the security. People estimate that the director cannot provide security, cannot fight the gang leaders because the gangs are so powerful. People protesting against insecurity because every time there's someone kidnapped, people from the neighborhood will raise up against the kidnapping to demand to release the person. Okay, so 2 days ago there were 2 days strike to stay down with kidnapping. Drivers union protested as well to demand the state do something with the kidnapping issue. So not only the kidnapping and security, because everywhere in Port-au-Prince you find gang violence. People, you find people are afraid going out. People don't know what to do.
The World Health Organization is urging nations to prioritize vaccinating health workers, as its new report says 115,000 of them may have died from COVID-19 as of May. The figure comes from a broader estimate of 80,000 to 180,000 deaths. WHO Director General insists all health staff must be vaccinated. On Thursday, he condemned global vaccine inequality, saying that less than 10% of health workers in Africa are fully vaccinated, while the number reaches over 80% in most high-income countries. Viviers is calling on G20 countries to immediately fulfill vaccine sharing commitments. The Chinese mainland is fighting another round of COVID infections. It reported 28 new domestic cases on Thursday and continues to see reports of positive cases today. Yang Shanshan has more from Beijing.
28 patients were detected within China, covering several provinces and metropolitan cities, including Beijing. A couple has been tested COVID positive in Beijing, and today another 4 new cases were also discovered in Beijing who have traveled from Inner Mongolia. The city has already locked down the residential area and supermarkets nearby where the patients had visited. Mass tests have been underway in that area. We have learned that at least some of the new cases in China detected these days actually come from close contacts of an elderly tourist group. This group departed from Shanghai on October 9th and then traveled to Xi'an and then to places of interest of Gansu and Inner Mongolia. Officials are doing mass tests in those affected areas to control the spread. Besides, the government also encouraged vulnerable groups or people with high-risk exposure to take extra shot to boost immunity level against the COVID.
Our country is mainly using the inactivated vaccine. Inactivated vaccines have been tested for nearly 100 years. They have very mild side effects. Therefore, the inoculation of a third dose is not much different from the first two. But some vaccines using new technologies, such as mRNA vaccines, usually will have stronger side effects as you take more inoculations. So risks for more inoculations in our country are very small.
As Winter Olympic Games is approaching, officials here are taking strict measures to ensure a safe environment for the coming athletes.
That's it for this edition of The World Today. I'll be back shortly with more news from the continent in Africa Live. Thank you so much for watching.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Trial of a Nigerian separatist accused of terrorism and treason begins. Ugandan soldiers to be tried for killing civilians in Somalia. And Libya's prime minister and several foreign powers endorse election to be held in December. Hello and welcome. You're watching Africa Live. We're coming to live from Nairobi. I'm Hannah Viviers. Here are more stories making headlines. In business, South Africa seeks $27 billion electricity infrastructure funding as it moves to ditch coal-fired plants. And in sport, CAF President Patrice Motsepe backs proposal to stage the FIFA World Cup every 2 years. Let's begin in Russia, where AFP is reporting that at least 15 people have been killed following a factory fire. Authorities report an explosion took place at a gunpowder factory southeast of Moscow. The Ministry of Emergency Situations says 170 emergency workers and 50 vehicles were dealing with the fire. Officials are investigating the cause of the inferno. They say they'll be looking at safety procedure violations, among other possible causes. Well, for more on this, we're joined by Julia Chapman, who's in Moscow for us. Thank you so much for joining us, Julia. What's the latest on this incident?
Well, we've been hearing from Russia's emergency ministry that at least 15 people are confirmed to have been killed in this explosion that took place on Friday morning. At least one person is in hospital with severe burns across his whole body, and one more person is so far unaccounted for. There were 17 people understood to have been working at this factory in the region of Ryazan, about 300 kilometers from Moscow. And this was a factory that we understand was producing industrial explosives and engaging in the disposal of ammunition as well. As you say, 170 emergency workers were sent to the scene, really underlying just how serious this explosion was. We do understand that the situation is under control now. The blaze has been extinguished, and emergency workers are still on the scene trying to understand what went wrong. Russia's acting emergencies minister even flew down to the scene himself to try to get to grips with what happened here. An investigation has been opened by the investigative committee of Russia into possible negligence. There are reports that some of the safety procedures may not have been carried out properly on Friday, but the investigative committee says they are looking into all possibilities as to what could have caused this tragic incident.
Julia, thank you so much for that update. Julia Chapman speaking to us from Moscow. Well, Nnamdi Kanu, the leader of Nigerian separatist group, the Indigenous People of Biafra, has pleaded not guilty to charges of treason and terrorism. The charges were leveled against him by the federal government. Kanu's trial was held amid heavy security and protests. CGTN's Kelechi Emekelam reports.
It's Nnamdi Kanu's day in court. Dozens of security officials have cordoned off the entrance gate to the Federal High Court in Abuja. Pandemonium breaks out as lawyers and the media are barred from entering the court's premises. That and a massive protest by supporters of the separatist group leader.
Can there be fair trial under this toxic atmosphere? I say no. With all due respect, there will be no fair trial. We're here to see and to hear. Like I said the last time, justice must not only be done, but must be seen to have been done.
The trial is being held behind closed doors. Kanu is facing 7 counts bordering on terrorism and treasonable felony, charges which he denies. His lawyer says they're baseless.
After studying the charge, we come to a conclusion that the charge is worthless and empty. So we have filed an application challenging the competency of the charge and the jurisdiction of the court to continue hearing this case.
Nnamdi Kanu allegedly declared himself leader of the Indigenous People of Biafra, IPOB, a group proscribed by the federal government. He was arrested by Interpol on June the 27th and has been in detention for 18 weeks. The court has fixed November 10 to hear his applications, questioning its jurisdiction to hear the case and the merit of the charges. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
AMISOM has confirmed that members of its force killed 7 civilians in Somalia. They were killed during an ambush by al-Qaeda-linked terrorists. A 6-member board of inquiry looked into the matter before releasing its findings. The soldiers' actions were found to be in breach of AMISOM's rules of engagement. The African Union mission to Somalia said that it would take full responsibility for what it termed as unlawful acts. It added that all the implicated soldiers would be brought to justice. All the soldiers involved are Ugandan nationals. We're now joined on that story by correspondent Colette Wanjohi in Addis Ababa for more on that. Colette, good to see you. Not great news, but to speak to us about this investigation and what happens next.
Well, with the investigations, we are seeing the African Union owning up to its peacekeeping mission's mistake to begin with. Then secondly, taking a legal action, which is what is supposed to happen in respect to the international humanitarian law as well as human rights. And also as a troop contributing country, Uganda will be expected, as the court martial continues, will be expected to get contact with the families directly and agree as to how atonement will be done. In this way, Uganda is also showing respect probably to its mission there and showing that it does not support any wrongdoing by its troops there. It is a matter of respect for the sovereignty of Somalia, respect for the community in Somalia where the troop contributing countries are rendering their services. But at the end of the day also for Uganda, it's more of a bilateral issue. It does not want to come into loggerheads with Somalia in terms of bilateral issues. So at the end of the day, we know this thing happened in August, and after that we saw President Yoweri Museveni speaking about it around in August, saying that it was wrong for the troops to have acted out of anger. That's what he suggested then. So what we are seeing now is African Union owning up, and of course some people within Somalia have said the process has taken so long, but at the end of the day, justice will be served. The lives of those who lost their lives might not come back, but at least respect will be given to the people of Somalia.
And I suppose right now that means a lot to the people that have suffered losses of loved ones. Thank you so much for that, Colette Wanjohi, speaking to us from Addis Ababa. Well, Libya's prime minister and several foreign powers have finally endorsed the holding of a national election on December the 24th. Since July, several warring parties could not agree on a roadmap for the elections. The polls aim to resolve years of turmoil and division in the North African country and create a new political leadership whose legitimacy is widely accepted. Prime Minister Abdulhamid Dbeibah made the announcement in Tripoli at a joint news conference with the Foreign Minister of Kuwait. The final communique on the elections include foreign ministers from France, Italy, the U.S., as well as the Arab states and United Nations officials.
The importance of taking the necessary measures to build confidence and create an appropriate environment in order to hold the national elections in a fair, transparent and inclusive manner on the 24th of December 2021. 6. Ending the conflict, achieving security and stability in Libya as a basis for establishing peace and building the state for peaceful coexistence and advancing the economy and development.
We all affirm our support for the initiative to support the stability of Libya, and we will not fail in this place to commend the efforts of the Joint Military Commission 5+5 by approving the plan of action for the expulsion of mercenaries, foreign fighters and foreign forces from Libya in a gradual and balanced manner and in phases.
In Sudan, huge crowds of people have marched in several parts of the capital Khartoum and other cities. Unlike the pro-military protests that took place over the weekend, these recent demonstrations are against the prospect of military rule in the country. The military has shared power with civilian parties since the removal of President Omar al-Bashir in 2019. However, Sudan's transitional government is facing deep tension and division. Those aligned with the military accuse the civilian parties of mismanagement and monopolizing power. Civilian leaders, though, say that the military aims to install a government it can control.
A full civil state, that's the choice of our nation. Even if at a certain time we're prepared for constitutional settlement and the army thought that this spirit was gone and that the revolution will stop, that is an illusion. People are out in their millions.
Yes for civil state, and yes for democratic transition, and no for army rule.
Senegal has reported 0 new COVID-19 cases for the first time since the outbreak. However, what has enabled the West African country to achieve this impressive result? Here are the details with correspondent Desiree Cannon in the capital, Dakar.
Senegal is managing COVID-19 cases despite limited resources. The country's health minister, Abdoulaye Diouf said this downward trend is due to the strict enforcement of preventive mechanisms such as wearing of masks, curfews, contact tracing, and early isolation of cases. Through the COVAX coalition, which aims to ensure equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, Senegal has received several batches of vaccines from China, USA, UK, France, Belgium, and Portugal. Senegal caseload stands at over 73,000, with more than 1,800 deaths. The Senegalese health minister said recording 0 new infections was reassuring, but it doesn't mean it is the end of the epidemic. To sustain the current downward trend, he called on the population to respect the preventive measures and to also get vaccinated. Desiree Cannon, CGTN, Dakar, Senegal.
It's time now for us to take a short break and return. More news in Africa Live, including Congolese students storm parliament over teachers' strike. And Egypt appoints a record number of women judges.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Restoration of China's seat in the United Nations was an epic diplomatic battle. A journey fraught with obstacles.
Yes!
Africa's support was crucial. Victory saw a new era in China-Africa ties, founded on a common future and shared prosperity.
Welcome back. You're watching Africa Live. Well, here on the continent, hundreds of school children stormed the Democratic Republic of Congo's parliament on Thursday, demanding an end to a teacher strike. Earlier this month, teachers went on strike over salaries, bonus pay, and other issues. The strike has now lasted over 2 weeks. The students waved their school uniforms while chanting, "We want to study." In September, the government launched a program for free primary schooling. Well, the Egyptian Council of State took a landmark step by appointing women judges for the first time since its founding. 98 women were sworn in on Tuesday to serve on one of the country's top judicial bodies. Here's Adel Amrouhi with more.
It's a major leap for women empowerment in Egypt's judiciary system. 98 women judges took oath this week to be delegates or deputies on the nation's Council of State. They are not going to be judges just yet. They have, however, officially begun a career that should see them sit on the bench of one of the most prestigious judicial bodies in the country.
I consider myself extremely lucky as I witnessed one of the most important moments in the history of Egyptian women's struggle. After more than 70 years, today, Egyptian women become members of the Council of State.
All of these women were already working in other judicial bodies. The Council of State stipulates that all its members must have no violations on the record during their legal career. They must be among the top-graded students in their law schools, and a master's degree or advanced graduate diplomas in law are also required.
It is an honor for us to be the first women who get accepted into the Council of State. It was a long selection process that began months ago. We applied, submitted our documents, had multiple interviews, and finally received a decree from the Egyptian president for the appointment.
The Council of State is a judicial body established in 1946 to look into state administrative issues which the government is involved. Since its founding, its board had always ruled against allowing women into their court. Earlier this year, the Supreme Council for Judicial Bodies, led by President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, made the historic decision of allowing women in the Council of State and the Prosecutor General's office.
While appointing 98 women judges in the Council of State has been widely celebrated, there is still a long way ahead for women in judicial authority. There are about 22,000 judges in Egypt, but according to the National Women Council, there are only 66 women judges. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
Over in South Africa, the Everett Reed Gallery in Johannesburg is presenting its first solo exhibition of contemporary artist Nandipha Mtambo. For this body of work, the artist traveled to Benin to capture images and learn more about the story of the Aguji women warriors. CGTN's Lisa Jamela has more.
Nandipha Mtambo is a well-known and respected artist who has broken barriers in the still white-dominated space. Mtambo is a trained sculptor. She's best known for her figurative cowhide sculptures, but she says in this exhibition she ventured into a different space.
I think because I get bored very quickly, I've always sort of pushed myself to try and understand the language of different media, because I think a performance versus a photograph or a painting answers different questions. So the space of abstraction, I think I explore through painting and the drawing, and then the very figurative I've always explored in my sculptural works. Yeah, I think it's about understanding that different media make a person react in different ways.
In this showcase, she has created sculptures in bronze inspired by an army of women known as Aguji, who were both feared and celebrated.
So essentially, this exhibition is about the Agoje, who initially were the bodyguards of the kings of Dahomey, so what we know as modern-day Benin Republic. And they started off as the bodyguards of the king, but then became incorporated into the army of the country.
The artist's experience of working in Benin, a country with a deep and richly mysterious voodoo culture, is infused throughout this exhibition.
Within the way that I'd worked before, I think my focus in terms of the mythologies that I was dealing with, some of the subject matters, whether it be bullfighting or the Minotaur, were quite European in a way. And so now I'm beginning to understand that myths of the beginnings of humanity, myths of creation, the merging of animals and humans within certain stories is very universal, because within the space of Benin Republic and even just in other cultures.
I think Nandipha's practice as a sculptor has then translated so beautifully into photography, into bronze, into the hides as sculpture, and into the paintings are beautifully sculpted. The paint itself has amazing texture. There's line, there's body, there's a three-dimensionality in all the work.
The exhibition is on until the 6th of November. Yulisa Njamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Your business news is up next. Here's what you can expect. South Africa seeks $27 billion electricity infrastructure funding as part of a plan to ditch coal-fired power plants.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climate and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Aden, Tunis, Cairo,
Juba,
Johannesburg, Ethiopia,
Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Time now for the day's business news. South Africa is seeking cheap financing for its electricity infrastructure. A senior presidency official, Rudy Dick, says over $27 billion is being sought as part of plans to move away from coal. Currently, over 80% of South Africa's electricity is reliant on burning coal. This makes it the world's 12th biggest carbon emitter. The state power company Eskom says it is seeking up to $12 billion from global lenders for the transition. A credit ratings agency, Moody's, has cut Ethiopia's sovereign credit rating for a second time since May. It's citing a delay in the nation's planned debt restructuring and an escalating civil war in the Tigray region. The company has lowered the rating one level to Caa2. Back in March, Moody's placed the country on review for a downgrade before cutting the rating 2 months later. The outlook is negative. A creditor committee to discuss Ethiopia's debt restructuring was formed in September, 8 months after the government announced plans to reorganize its liabilities under a Group of 20 relief program. Meanwhile, a civil war in the nation has intensified, with government troops carrying out airstrikes this week in the Tigray region. Well, Moody's also has some bad news for Tunisia. Its negative outlook was largely due to delays in reforms as well as funding that would have come thereafter.
Moody's noted that the recent formation of a new government led by Prime Minister Najla Bouden paves the way for renewed negotiations with official and bilateral lenders. Analysts maintain that Tunisia needs a stable political and social climate in the next period.
It's necessary that the president declare the end of the period of exceptional measures and to announce a clear roadmap. This would convey a positive message of reassurance to international financial institutions and donors, as well as the countries that want to help Tunisia close the budget gap this year.
Moody's Investors Service added that for next year, renewed access to multilateral and bilateral loans will most likely rely on the successful negotiation of an IMF program that has remained elusive since the previous 4-year program was cancelled in April 2020. Experts have said that the absence of the conditions for a new funding could plunge the country into an unprecedented crisis.
For 2022, the situation will be very different and more difficult, because the IMF knows well that Tunisia cannot develop next year's state budget without IMF funding. That's why the IMF will impose new conditions and reforms during negotiations and put an austerity program on the table. This scenario could have dangerous social repercussions and create a political crisis for the president, who had promised to improve the economic situation.
President Kais Saied criticized Tunisia's relationship with rating agencies and fund donors. The head of state also called for the need to change the sovereign ratings approach of international rating agencies.
The Transport Department will open all the pending files and reveal the state strategy as soon as possible in order to better manage all state-owned companies and enterprises.
Tunisian economists explained that rating agencies evaluate the ability of debt issuers to meet their financial commitments and determine the country's abilities to borrow from international financial markets. Moody's fiscal deficit estimate of 7.7% of GDP in 2021 and 5.9% in 2022 implies gross borrowing requirements of about 18% of GDP this year and 16% in 2022.
Analysts assert that the deterioration of Tunisia's sovereign rating over the last decade is mainly due to the political instability and the decline in most economic and financial indicators. The new government of Najla Bouden needs to improve these indicators and to implement urgent economic and social reforms.
Closely watched index, which is food inflation, dropped to 19.6% in September from 20.3% recorded in the prior month. CGTN's Deji Badmosi has more on that story.
This is the sixth consecutive decline that Nigeria would be recording since April, after the inflation rate peaked at 18.17% in January this year. But the rate of moderation in the inflation figures have been slow and not far-reaching. Prices of goods and services are still very high and beyond the reach of many.
We are talking about just less than 1% drop in the inflation rate. So the drop was very marginal, and inflation rate, I'm talking of headline inflation now, at 16.63% is still very, very high. If there is any complaints around the economy today among the economic players and among the citizens, the complaints are about inflation, the high prices of goods and services. So that speaks to the fact that there is still a whole lot that we need to do as far as inflation is concerned.
Nigeria's inability to attract enough foreign exchange has proven to be a challenge for the economy. Items listed in the core inflation report, which rose by 13.74% in September, depend heavily on scarce forex for importation.
The depreciation in the exchange rate has taken a huge toll on prices across practically all product groups. We are now talking about exchange rate of 570, 575. I think that is quite significant, and that is taking a huge toll on prices, both on core inflation and on food inflation. Then we have challenges of liquidity in the foreign exchange markets. Even accessing foreign exchange, especially in the official window, has remained a major challenge. That is affecting the capacity of manufacturers to access raw materials, and therefore affecting their capacity utilization, and therefore affecting their outputs. And when we have challenges on the supply side, it has implications for inflation.
Food inflation has continued to rise since 2019, when Nigeria closed some of its land borders to control smuggling and recoup lost revenue. Despite reopening its borders, the price of food items is yet to record appreciable decline.
Security is a major problem around food inflation, especially because of the impact of insecurity on agricultural production. Most of the farmers that are supposed to be on their farm, cultivating, harvesting, planting, and all of that, many of them are afraid to go to farm. Many of them are currently in IDP camps. So this is taking a huge toll also on food inflation. Then we have the challenge of high transaction costs at the ports. Getting goods in and out of the port, particularly Lagos ports, has become a very, very difficult thing. This is also contributing to inflation because the high transaction costs will have to be transferred ultimately to the final consumers.
The government has an ambitious plan to bring the inflation rate down to 13% by 2022. For now, though, the biting inflation is eroding people's purchasing power. If the figures do not decline appreciably and quickly, it might be only a matter of time before labor unions in the country begin to push for a raise in wages. Deji Badmosi, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
South African headline inflation was up 5% year-on-year in September from 4.9% in August. The news comes as some experts warn that the South African Reserve Bank could hike interest rates next month. Angela Coppola has the story.
Of some concern is the increase in core inflation from 3.1% in August to 3.2% in September.
We saw OER and rentals, mostly OER picking up. And you would remember that in March, we saw a trough in that number. Subsequently, in June, we saw a pickup in both OER and rentals. And now in September, we've seen a further pickup in OER. And that's mostly what's driven core inflation higher.
There are also concerns about fairly significant intermediate price pressures on chemicals and plastics.
And what we're watching is to see whether those percolate up into the level of the CPI. But so far, we haven't actually seen that. And I think that's the very important question going forward, is how much of this kind of pipeline pressure actually ends up showing up in the CPI, which after all is what hits consumers and it's what the SARB is targeting.
There's also services inflation that could move higher from a historic low of 2.9%.
We are seeing more pressure from the goods side instead of the services side. But as we see vaccinations come through and people start to move around and possibly labor market improvements, we could see services inflation start to pick up, especially if you consider that there might be market concentration in some of these services industries, such as tourism, because of the pandemic and lockdown and some of those business closures. So we could see pricing pressure being passed on to the supplier or producer instead of the consumer.
Consumers will be worrying about rising food and fuel prices when the data is published in the next month.
What's concerning is that we have food prices slowly starting to rise. We expected the fuel price rises. I think that's a given, and we're going to get more of them in future. So I think from now on, CPI is probably going to stay elevated above 5%. And I think if the oil prices don't come down pretty soon in the next month or two, I think it's going to be a problem for next year.
The upward movement of inflation is an issue, and the consensus view is that interest rates will be increased fairly soon.
So we think that the first rate increase is going to be only in March next year, but the market is pricing in a rate increase for the November meeting. And in fact, the market is pricing in 200 basis points of tightening over the next 12 months. We think that's far too hawkish.
With inflation pressures likely to keep trending upwards, there's going to be pressure now to increase those interest rates sooner rather than later. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, this is a tough period for any nation trying to recover from the economic downturn from the effects of COVID-19 and also the latest global energy shortages. As a result, the Egyptian government is outlining measures to support local businesses and help them to still grow amidst the economic volatility. CGTN's Yasser Kim has more.
The government's set of incentives has mainly targeted the manufacturing sector. A crucial element is freezing electricity prices and subsidizing all energy costs for industrialists in the next few years to protect them from the looming global energy crisis.
This will be very encouraging for investors and comforting too, as energy prices constitute 30 to 40% of the cost of production for many industries. So freezing energy prices for 5 years creates stability and a positive climate for businesses, especially in that energy prices globally are increasing rapidly.
Special significance has been given to the African market, but a lot more needs to be done. Sharif Al-Gabali, whose factories export fertilizers and chemical products in the continent, for instance, says support is needed to tackle the various challenges facing exporters.
African markets require a unique approach. There must be a physical presence in African countries. There must be logistical centers established by the state in various countries. Shipping and transport routes have to improve. Shipping lines are still not regular. Money transfer to some African countries are still a challenge, while in others are fine. Every country has its unique culture, and we should learn how to approach the different cultures. We cannot consider Africa as one market.
He welcomed the new incentives that include 80% subsidies on shipping costs, tax cuts for those exporting to the rest of the continent, and a state-owned holding company to market Egyptian products to the African markets.
Egypt has huge potential to export to Africa, whether in the engineering industries, agricultural products, electrical products, chemicals, and construction material. Our role is to open the door for the Egyptian products in the African markets. We only deliver 1% of Africa's needs, which is about $4 billion. We have an ambitious plan to reach tenfold this amount in the next 5 years.
The government is also giving special attention to local car assembly plants in its incentive scheme. Proper infrastructure at no cost, tax exemptions and logistical support will be offered for companies that produce excess of 10,000 cars annually, using at least 45% local components.
The incentives program will cost the budget an upwards of $4 billion, but the government says on the long term it will help manufacturers grow, exports increase, create more jobs, and then bring in more tax revenue and attract foreign investments to the North African country. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
The sport headlines after the show break, including CAF President Patrice Motsepe backs proposal to stage the FIFA World Cup every 2 years.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
My love for cooking started from a very, very young age.
Sky is known a lot in here about the work that she's doing, showing the products of Lesotho and the cuisines of Lesotho.
In my lifetime, I had never come across a recipe book for our traditional dishes. And so when she came up with the idea, I thought it was a very brilliant one.
I'm hoping that one day people will look back and still know those traditional Basotho dishes. And that's what I'm trying to achieve.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
We begin our sport coverage with football and the raging debate over the proposal to stage the FIFA World Cup every 2 years. CAF President Patrice Motsepe has backed calls to stage the global football showpiece biannually. He said it could be an opportunity for Africa to benefit financially while strengthening the sport on the